But I wanted to take a few minutes to deal with this topic of freedom and fear. I think it's an appropriate topic. How do you become financially free? And the definition of freedom is to have options. And it's also to have peace of mind in uncertain times. And I think the primary way that you have freedom is to realize that that's not how much money you have. You could be totally financially independent and have all the money in the world. That is, we have people that are financially independent, but they're still not free. And they're very stressed out. I just heard a story from an advisor even this morning that one of his clients who has $5 million in cash and additional investments above that is still not free. And the reason is money's on the throne of his life. And so the first thing I would say to you to be financially free is you've got to realize that Luke 16:11 to 13 is true. You cannot serve God and money. So the first key to freedom is to make sure God's on the throne of your life, not money, and realize that his promises are true. He promises to meet our needs no matter what we find ourselves in. The psalmist says, I've been young and I've been old, and I've never seen the righteous begging for bread. So financial freedom is different than financial independence. You can be financially free if you don't have a lot, and that's because you realize that God's got it. He's still on his throne. You don't have to be fearful. I'd say the other thing to think about when we think about fear is that the antidote to fear is courage. And courage is to think correctly. It's called firmness of mind. So part of what we have to realize as we're going through this pandemic, and we've been through a very difficult time the last couple of months, is we have to think correctly about our situation. So the first thing I would encourage us to remember is this isn't the first dramatic thing that's ever happened in our economy. I've been in this business 40 years. I started in 1980, so 4 decades ago I started. And of course, in the 80s, we had the stock market crash of 87. Then we had, of course, the Gulf War in the early 90s, and then 9/11 in the early 2000s. Then the end of the 2000s, we had the Great Recession with the market tumbling. And then, of course, we were experiencing what we're experiencing now. I can even go back further. In fact, I found this sheet, and it's interesting. I just went back 4 decades, because that's how long I've been in the business, to show that there's been uncertainty over every decade. But in the 20s, you had the Black Tuesday stock market crash. In the 30s, you had the Great Depression. And unemployment reached 30%. In the 40s, we had Pearl Harbor and the U.S. entry into World War II. In the 50s, we had the Korean War and the Asian flu pandemic. Sounds familiar, another pandemic. In the 60s, we had the Cuban Missile Crisis and assassination of a president, the Vietnam War. In the 70s, we had the oil embargo. So I share those things with you to just remind you, as I have to remind myself, that there's always going to be uncertainty. The key is, what are the things that we should be doing to handle this uncertainty? How do we become financially free in these fearful times? So I want to share with you a few things that can maybe help your thinking relative to surviving this time we find ourselves in. So let me start by just giving us 4 P's. And the first P is perspective. And perspective is powerful. Now, what do I mean by perspective is powerful? Well, I think the thing we need to remember is, like I just said, there's always been adversity, there's always been difficult times, but I think even more recently, let's keep perspective. How did the stock market do? How did your 401k and your investment accounts do last year if you had them invested in the market? Probably pretty good. You might have been up 10, 15, 20%, depending on how you were diversified last year. And so you take the 15 or 20% and don't think about it in 2019, but then this year we have a downturn with your long-term investments, and it can be very unsettling. And so I like to say that keep perspective. We can't accept good from God and not adversity. Ecclesiastes and Job talk about that. Should we accept good from God and not adversity? And so let me just encourage you to keep perspective. Had a really good year last year. This year, maybe not so good. We need to keep that in perspective and realize that those kind of things kind of ebb and flow. So don't forget what's happened in the past. So the second thing I would share, in addition to perspective being powerful, is that principles equal peace of mind. I'm going to unpack 4 principles for you here in a minute that will help you during this time and help you as you continue to move ahead in your financial life. But just remember, perspective does lead to peace of mind. And let me read to you something we just received from a client earlier this week, April 21st. And we've been getting a lot of these emails from our clients really thanking us for helping them apply these 4 principles I'm about to share as a result of what we went through in 08-09. We've been very clear with our clients that we need to learn from 08-09, and most of our clients did learn, and as a result have applied these principles and therefore had peace of mind in this very uncertain time. But listen to this. As my wife and I have talked during this COVID-19 craziness, we have several times noted how thankful we are to be debt-free and have established an emergency fund. It has helped us not be anxious about making it through this unprecedented time in our lives. Once again, God's principles are proven the best for us, even when they seem so small during the process. In today's world, we typically see those that get wealthy taking chances be celebrated, and the ones who follow biblical guidance questioned. Just wanted to drop a note to say how much we appreciate you and your team's financial guidance in our lives. Thanks for holding the line on biblical principles and giving godly financial advice. And so I really love that, and this has been similar to several others that we've gotten over the last few weeks, but just see what he said there. You know, God's principles, they always work, they're always relevant, and they're always applicable. It said, even though they seem small during the process. And I think that's one thing we have to remember, is do we have the courage? Remember I said courage is the antidote to fear. Do we have the courage to apply the principles even when they don't seem to be working? Many times when the market's going up like it has for the most part of the last 10 years, it's very tempting to not diversify. It's very tempting not to have cash. It's very tempting not to pay off debt. We're going to unpack those in a few minutes here. But we have to have the courage to apply the principles even when you think they might not be working or they're doing the opposite of what maybe your friends and others are doing. So I wanted to share that with you. And now we want to unpack the 4 principles. And so the first principle is, and these are going to seem very simple, and they are simple, but they work. Just like what this person here said, they don't regret applying the principles. And that's the thing. You'll never regret applying the principles. So the first one is, you need to spend less than you make. You say, well, Russ, that seems really trite and simple, but what I found is that a lot of people don't even know if they're doing that. Fact is, we've just written a book, and you'll get this, you can ask Phil about it, but it's called Your Money Made Simple, and the reason we wrote the book is, like I said, I've done this for 40 years, and what we realize is that a lot of people don't even know if they're spending less than they make, okay? There's 5 uses of money, and so you have to give. So here's your income. You pay your taxes. You pay off may have some debt payments, credit cards, things like this, and then you have your living expenses, and what's left over is savings. The key to financial freedom is this number being positive. But what I've learned is that a lot of people have no idea how much they have to make to support their lifestyle. They don't really know what's in the boxes. The reason I know this is some people are borrowing to fund their retirement but don't know it. The reason I know it is they're not paying down their credit card debt or their car debt or whatever. So the point is, the first principle, and we're talking about these principles, is to spend less than you make and have a positive margin. And so we got some questions that Phil sent me. I'll answer in a little bit and unpack this a little more, but this is the first principle. Know what you have to make sure you have a positive margin. And that's one of the first keys, because then you know where you can cut. If you have a positive margin, maybe you can take a pay cut and still be okay. In fact, let me just mention something, and we're going to talk about emergency funds here in a few minutes, but we always tell people to have, you've heard 3 to 6 months living expenses in an emergency fund, and as you get older, maybe it's 6 to 12 months, or maybe even 1 to 2 years, depending on where you are in your life cycle. Well, here's what's interesting. If everybody did this, if everybody had a 3-month surplus in their emergency fund, then technically they could take a 25% pay reduction and still be okay, still be able to live and give and keep going as if nothing has happened. Unfortunately, one of the reasons you see such panic right now is because people don't have the emergency fund. They don't have staying power. I really like what this individual said here. Thanks for helping us establish an emergency fund. So we'll talk about that some more in a minute when we get to another one of the principles, but suffice it to say that we need to spend less than we make. If we have an emergency fund, we could have an income reduction and still be okay for a period of time. So that's principle one, spend less than you make. Principle two, and they also mention this in the memo, get out of debt. Okay, so let's just talk about this a little bit. And what you start off by getting rid of all the consumer debt, your card, credit cards, things like that. But there's another debt that most people have that they really should pay off that they haven't thought about, and that's their house. I mean, back here, one of the biggest living expense items is your mortgage. Well, guess what? If you don't have a mortgage and your living expenses are less, this means the amount of money you have to make is less. And so let's just talk about why this is so important to get out of debt and how people think about it. Let's say your living expenses were $40,000 a year, but you spent $41,000. That means you overspent $1,000 a year. And you did that for 10 years, you owe $10,000. Okay? And that's kind of the average credit card debt of every American. And let's say now you decide, okay, I've been through COVID-19, I really want to get out of debt, and I want to pay off this $10,000 of credit card debt. So you decide you're going to pay off $1,000 a year principal, and let's say it's 10% interest. The interest would be $1,000 of interest, right? So that's $2,000. Here's my question. How much do you have to reduce your lifestyle to pay off this debt at $1,000 a year principal and $1,000 a year interest? And most people do say $2,000. They've just forgotten one thing: they got to quit overspending. So it's 3 times as hard to get out as it ever was to get in. So I just share that illustration to kind of help you understand the subtlety of debt and how hard it is to get out once you get in. And it's 3 times as hard to get out as it is to get in. And I think the point is, if you get rid of all your consumer debt and this box is 0 and you pay down your mortgage, this box goes down, you have a lot more freedom. And we talk about that in this book. We really unpack that in this book, so let me encourage you to maybe get a hold of that. Let me tell you a couple stories that we talk about getting out of debt. And like I said, we went through 08, 09, and the market was so strong from 03 to 07 that a lot of people just thought, well, why would I pay off my house at 4 or 5% when the market's so good? And so many people didn't. Then, of course, the market tanked in March of, hit the bottom in the March of 2009, and people were wishing, gosh, I wish I paid off my debt. So let me give you 2 stories. I have a friend, and he stops me in the neighborhood, and he said, hey, I've got a big bonus from HP. I work for HP. What should I do with it? I said, well, you should pay off your house. So this is a friend of mine. He's been talking to me over the years. He said, well, I just can't do that. I got to invest it. Never paid off his house. So finally, after 2 or 3 years of just talking to him, he finally got a Ron Blue advisor, and he finally paid off his house. And so when the market starts crashing in March, I called him and said, hey, aren't you glad you paid off your house? It was a $300,000 mortgage. Aren't you glad you paid off your house? He goes, well, I'm really worried about my tax bill, which is coming up, because he didn't have the interest deduction. I said, really? You're worried about a little bit more in taxes when your account right now would be down $90,000 had you invested it? He says, man, thanks for sharing that with me. I need that way of thinking. He says, you just do this as muscle memory. You think like this, but I don't think like that. So thanks for encouraging me. It's kind of like this client here, thanking them for helping them do the principles. And so I just thought that was interesting. He was worried about not having a tax deduction versus if he would have invested it, he would have been down $30,000 and that, or $90,000, 30% on 300. And that would have really been a fearful thing for him. Let me tell you one more story. I went to the dermatologist in March, and I went with my wife, and we get a full body check. We like to do lake stuff and all that things. But anyway, so she's talking to me while she's supposed to. I said, why don't you just make sure you check all the moles and quit. I know women can do more than one thing at a time, but I said just check the moles, and then we'll talk about your investment. She said, should I put more in the market right now? So we got done. I'm sitting there, and I said, well, what's your plan? I don't know if she put more in the market or not. And she told me she was down about 15 or 20% at the time, and she was down about 80,000. And I said, well, let me ask you a question. Have you paid off your house? She goes, oh, no, I would never pay off my house. My advisor told me I needed a deduction, and she can make more from me in the market. And I thought, how many times have I heard that over 40 years? And so that's kind of the thinking. So we all have a choice here. See, You and I have a choice to either apply the principles or not. And like this person said on this email, it seems kind of small during the process, really pay off my house, really have money in the bank, the market's going up, but you never regret applying these principles. But I just found it was interesting because she was struggling with, should she invest more? And I'm saying, take the guaranteed 4% and pay off your house. So be getting out of debt. That's the second principle. And I hope what you're hearing as I'm talking through these things is maybe some of you have done this and you can be grateful. Some of you maybe haven't done this. Build a conviction during this time that when the market cycles back and everything cycles, that next time you will apply these principles, like it said here. Do what's best, what's proven to be best, even when it seems so small during the process. You may get laughed at, the market's going up, or your business is going crazy, and you're not taking any money out to pay off debt and all that, but you'll never regret applying these principles. Let me give you two more. Like I said, there's only four. If you apply these, you'll have financial freedom in fearful times. 3 is to diversify. And that's not just diversify by asset class, but it's diversify by time horizon. So we encourage our clients, you have the emergency fund, like we talked about. That's, 3 months to maybe 2 years cash. And that's not earning you very much, okay? But that's okay. It's an emergency fund. It's there for such a time as this. Then you have your short-term money, you have your intermediate-term money, and you have your long-term money. This is like 2-year money. This is like 5 to 10 years, and this is 10 years plus. And so here's the thing. This recent market downturn has really only impacted this bucket out here. So we call this the bucket approach, but if you bucketed your investments so that you have emergency fund, which is cash, you have short-term, you have intermediate-term, and you have long-term, then the only one that you're reading about and seeing the market go down is really going to be out here. And so hopefully if you do that, you have some peace of mind realizing that the reason this is out here is you don't need the money for 10 years. You put your money in the bucket or the investment that based on when you're going to need it. So obviously, the closer you get to retirement and things like that, then more money should be pulled this way, which means you shouldn't have had so much money at risk anyway. But what happens is people get greedy. People get greedy, and they end up subtly having more in long term because they're chasing the yield rather than being disciplined to say, when do I need the money, and make sure I've got it in the right buckets. And like this email said, the emergency fund is critical. The two things that have helped people have peace of mind and weather this recent downturn the best, they have emergency fund, in other words, cash in the bank, and they have no debt, which we just talked about. You don't have debt, including your home, which by the way is debt, then you can weather. We have many people say, I'm really glad you had me have all this money in less than 10-year investments so that I can continue to be generous and not panic about paying bills. So obviously the returns here are going to be less than they are potentially out here and they were last year, but you'll never regret, like I said, applying the principles. So diversify based on time horizons. When do you need the money? When need money, okay? That's the question. And be getting out of all debt, and you'll never regret having some cash. You never regret having cash. And that leads to the final principle, and that is to continue to be generous. So here's the point. We've talked about having an emergency fund, and so let's say your income, so here's the point. Some of you listening to this are still doing okay, and you have an emergency fund, you have a year's expense, you don't have any debt and things like that. You should continue to be generous to meet the needs of those who don't have. 2 Corinthians 8 talks about the fact that some have to meet the needs of those who don't have. So when you don't have, they can meet your needs. And I think that you never regret continuing to be generous. The tendency would be to clam up now. Guys, my income's down, the market, my retirement account's down 25%, I'm going to quit giving. But in reality, it was within your ability, biblically, and we see that in the scriptures, we need to keep being generous. And I'm wondering, just something I've been thinking about and personally been wrestling with is, I wonder if I have my emergency fund which I've never had to use, by the way. Most of you listening to this haven't had to use your emergency fund. Maybe you've had to do a septic or a washer and dryer or whatever, but you've never had to use 6 months or 12 months up. You probably never had to use it all up because you didn't have any income. Well, maybe this year, if your income is down, maybe I still give and live as if it's not down, because maybe I'm supposed to dip into my emergency fund this year to continue to meet needs and to be available to those around me. And maybe that's the faith step for us that have is, am I willing to use my emergency fund to meet needs? You know, when this all started happening, Julie and I have a cleaning service, and the lady showed up in the middle of March, and I just said, well, how are you doing? I said, well, we just lost six customers. Well, my original thought when everything started happening in March was I need to go in and cut my living expenses as much as I can. I really don't need a cleaning service. But then God, kind of helped me think through this. I thought, maybe we should pay for the 6 people that they just lost. Maybe that's what God wants us to do. So we didn't talk to Julie, and she said, yeah, we need to do that. So we basically said, we'll pay for the 6 you just lost for the next month, in addition to continue to keep you on, and we'll prepay you for the next year because of social distancing. Don't even come, but we'll pay you as if you've come. But here's my point. You never regret continuing to be generous. So what am I saying here? The key to financial freedom in fearful times is to apply these 4 principles. Okay? You spend less than you make, so make sure you know what that is, and make sure you have a positive margin. Make sure and this is, if I had to say which of these principles is the most important for fearful, going through fearful times, it's this one. Make sure you don't have any debt. That gives you lots of options. That's the definition of freedom, is to have options. So make sure you've gotten out of debt, all debt, including your home. And so like I said, a crisis is a horrible thing to waste. So as we've gone through this, don't forget these learnings and build a conviction like this person did here to apply the principles even when it doesn't feel like it's the right thing to do. When the market's going crazy, everything's going up, and it seems to make no sense to pay off my house, you're going to do it because you want to apply these principles so you're in a position to weather the next time we cycle. And as we saw here, there's always going to be a cycle. Every decade there's been something that's been traumatic. So spend less than you make, get out of debt, diversify based on time horizons. If you've done this and haven't gotten greedy and moved it all out here, then you should be okay. And as we just said, continue to be generous. So I hope that those principles, I know they're simple. That's why we call this book, Your Money Made Simple. They're not complicated, but they're not necessarily easy to do. So let me encourage you that the way to have peace of mind in uncertain times is to apply the principles. You never regret applying them, but it's going to cause you to have the courage to do them when times are good.